I've been asked to do a short film about Danny Phantom and what was going on in the fandom at the time that I watched it. I initially got into the show because I was in college with a large load and I needed something to do to relax on my downtime. That ended up being a bunch of silly cartoons, one of which was Danny Phantom. I loved that show. I came into the series fairly early on, so I began to follow it. After a while, I began to meet other people on DeviantArt who liked the show as much as I did, and the fandom grew. A little before the second season came out, a movement from some of the fans caught on. They'd paired some characters together that were not canon. That in and of itself wouldn't have been a problem had the pairing not included a man over 40 years and a boy age 14. Yeah. I can't say whether it really happened, but it got around in the fandom that Mr. Hartman had asked people to not pair those two together. This is where the fandom started really splitting. One side wanted to follow Mr. Hartman's wishes and labeled themselves true fans. They also labeled those who did not want to follow his wishes as anti-fans. Initially, I went along with the group that wanted to follow Mr. Hartman's wishes, joined a few boards, entertained myself with stories and writing and roleplay when I found the time. I was still friends with some people who had been labeled anti-fans, but I figured that just as long as they knew my opinion and respected it, there would be no problems. And then I started noticing that the true fans were being kind of anal about what should be counted as true fan material. No deaths were allowed, no pregnancies, it didn't matter how innocent. No mention of drug problems, past, present, or preventative, were allowed to be described in anything that was posted on the message boards. I was a little frustrated, but brushed it off as, well, hey, if that's what Mr. Hartman wants. After The Ultimate Enemy came out, the true fans changed a lot of their policies on death, but not on anything else, and then they really started to crack down on even the mere mentions of anything in the topics that I've previously mentioned. If one use of the word beer or pregnant was mentioned, the story would be taken down on a few sites and ridiculed by others. It was kind of disgusting to watch. And it started to get to a point where online yelling matches with vulgar language, nasty slurs, outright trolling were more common than they had been even a few months before. And I know we lost more than a few people from the fandom that way, chased away cruelly by people that they used to call friend. Then an admin on a main message board that I was a part of approached me and said that if I wanted to continue to be allowed to post there, I had to stop being friends with certain people, but they had been labeled as anti-fans. I think that's when I really realized just how bad things had gotten. So I told them, as politely as I could, where to go and how to get there, and I quit the site. About when this war was reaching its height, we heard about the cancellation, which is why so many people assumed it was the fandom that killed the show. The announcement happened in January of 2006. Naturally, there were a few efforts to get the fandom back together, a couple of protests started, and several memes that went around, like someone drawing a picture of themselves holding on to the hand of another person, and it would go around as if we were all forming a chain to stop the show from being cancelled. Some of the protests ended up in front of the studios themselves, but there were other protests organized to raise awareness and ask for help to stop the program's cancellation in other places in the country too. The protests I heard of, or were a part of helping to plan, were supposed to be respectful affairs where the fans would show up with signs and they would talk to people passing that wasn't supposed to be invasive at all. I do know that some fans showed up in costume or would show up and be rambunctious, and then they were asked not to. Some were even asked to leave, and they were told that it wasn't respectful enough. Instead of uniting the fandom, it actually seemed to bring up more problems. By the time the third season came around, it felt as if the show's quality had dropped, and a lot of the fans were noticing. We still sent in petitions and tried to get the studios to listen to us, but nothing happened. Eventually, the show ended on a rather low note, and the splintered fandom ended up moving on to other things.